My name is Chris Clark, and I'm a beef specialist with Iowa State University covering central and south central Iowa. We're here today to discuss a research project here at the McNay Research Farm about evaluating rotations of cover crops and summer annuals. So we started this project back in the summer of 2019, and at the time, cash crop prices were relatively low, hay prices were very high, and we were looking at some different ways to basically increase forage production across the state of Iowa. In terms of water quality and conservation, we know that the benefits of cover crops are pretty well documented, but we still would like to see more utilization and more implementation of cover crop use across the state. And we just wanted to do a demonstration project showing a rotation of cool season cover crops and then following with summer annuals to kind of fill in some gaps in forage production. We started in the summer of 2019 with seeding of warm season annuals. So we used 5 different species. We started with teff grass and 2 different species of millet, so a Japanese millet and a pearl millet. And we did sorghum sudan grass and crabgrass. And basically let those grow until late summer, early fall, and started taking forage samples to look at nutrient value or forage quality and yield numbers as well. Then we terminated those crops after harvest, followed with cool seasons going into the fall. So we did a fall seeding of cool seasons that included a couple varieties of wheat, triticale, barley, and cereal rye. Same kind of thing with those. We let those obviously go over the winter, came back in the spring in early to mid-May, and did the sampling to get yield value and forage quality, and then just kind of kept that rotation going for a few more years. So in this project, we did not graze. We didn't incorporate cattle. We simply did small plot work. We had replicated plots at actually 3 different research farms, really focused on forage quality and yield potential. And so we did the sampling to get those numbers, and then between each reseeding of the next crop, we would simply terminate. We'd bale off the residue and then terminate with spray and then come back in and seed the next crop. So some of what we learned that I found most interesting would be some of the logistical things, just very practical things like which species overwintered well, some things in terms of which species were more difficult or more easy to establish. So for example, we had some producers that were interested in using barley because barley is known to be pretty nutritious and pretty palatable. It really did not overwinter well for us, and so we had very minimal yields at all 3 different farms actually, very minimal yields and just poor emergence in the spring. We learned a little bit about maturation of like rye versus wheat. The wheat tended to mature a little more slowly than the rye and the triticale. And so we tended to harvest those a little bit later based on maturity of the plant. We were shooting for like harvest at boot stage to minimize or to replicate what people might do to harvest for silage. And so we harvested the rye a little earlier, about 7 to 14 days earlier than the wheat. And so the wheat would have a greater yield simply because it had more growing days before harvest. Crabgrass proved a little difficult to establish. It's a little slower to germinate, but then it became very persistent and very competitive after it finally took off. And so that was a learning issue. Teff grass is another one that's difficult to establish. We probably didn't prepare the seed bed adequately for that one. It really requires a pretty firm seed bed and a very shallow seeding depth. So we probably didn't have the seed bed prepared firmly enough, and we probably seeded a little too deep, and it struggled to take off as well. In addition to those practical things, I think we found some good things in terms of just knowing quality of the forage. Most of the forages that we harvested at that stage were kind of in the later vegetative stages of growth, and so as you would expect are pretty palatable, pretty high quality in terms of nutrient concentration. And then we got some yield numbers that can be helpful just in terms of figuring out which species a producer might prefer. Yeah, so I actually refer to our findings a lot and refer to our experiences quite a bit when I get questions from producers. I refer back to those practical things. You know, if a producer's asking about crabgrass or teff or whatever, I feel like I have some good experience and good information to share there on some of those practical and logistical things. I've had producers ask about barley in parts of the state that are maybe even north of here, where I say, man, I don't know if it's really going to be your ideal choice for overwintering in that part of the state. And yeah, I think the yield and the nutritional values, or the yield and the forage quality information that we have, I think is really valuable to producers. I think one of the reasons that we wanted to do the project was to maybe help break down some barriers to implementation of using cover crops. So, like I said earlier, I think we know that the long-term conservation benefits of cover crops are pretty well documented, but it's a little harder to pencil out the use of cover crops in the short term. And so I think if we can view those as an additional forage resource and kind of make the most of those forage resources, I think that can be helpful. So that's something that's exciting to me, is I think if we can encourage people to use those cover crops that go kind of over the winter and into the spring for not only the conservation benefits, but for some forage production, I think that's a win-win. And then in terms of the summer annuals, there's a couple aspects there that are interesting to me. So one is that sometimes managing the calendar is kind of difficult. If we're thinking about using a cover crop in the spring as a forage resource, but we're also thinking about coming back in with a cash crop, sometimes when it's about ready to graze, it's almost time to terminate and plant our cash crop. And so are there ways to incorporate summer annuals with the use of those cover crops to kind of make the calendar more manageable? The other benefit of that is that in Iowa, we tend to rely on perennial cool season pastures. And we tend to have kind of a summer slump where the pastures go dormant, don't grow very well during the heat of the summer. And so I think there's an opportunity to fill in that gap of forage production with those summer annuals. And again, it kind of just fits. It can be kind of a win-win. We have the conservation benefits of the cool season annuals through the winter, come in with an annual forage to kind of fill in that forage gap during the summer, make the calendar a little more manageable, and hopefully get more forage and more cattle on the land.
My name is Erica Lundy-Woolfolk. I am a beef specialist serving Southwest Iowa for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. One of our goals with this project was to really focus on showing producers what they can get in terms of amount of annual forages per acre. And so we started this project at a time when cow numbers were kind of on a downhill slide and have continued to be less every year as well. Also on the flip side of that too, we have less pasture and forage acres that are available to us. So our goal was to really demonstrate to producers this option of an annual forage rotation to help add into their grazing system and keep some of those cow herd numbers here in southern Iowa. So in terms of this project, it was really kind of all hands on deck. So we had both our field agronomist and our beef specialist that were as part of this team. And so we looked at some of the nutrient quality, how those forages would help fill some gaps in terms of the production cycle for the cow herd. Our agronomists that were on team were really helpful and beneficial in helping us with some of the species selection, some of the management of those species, and how that would fit into the typical enterprise of our farming families here in southern Iowa. One of the big things that I feel is exciting from this project is really kind of showing the response to nitrogen. So a lot of our producers here look at the annual forages as an option to help capture and keep some of those nutrients in the soil. And while that's important too, we also know that those plants need some nitrogen and some of those other fertilizers to help have the best productivity possible. And so one of the nice things that we did with this study is that in our plot works, we had some plots that received no nitrogen while others received 50 pounds of nitrogen. And we really did see a very nice response when we did apply that nitrogen, which is really beneficial because that's giving us more tons of forage per acre to utilize for that cow herd. So in this project, we just looked at 0 or 50 pounds of N that was applied. And we chose the upper limit of 50 pounds because that's pretty standard for what gets applied to our pasture acres. Those perennial pastures that we have, pretty common to see 50 pounds of N that's applied. And there's been a lot of research that has showed that's kind of the happy medium in terms of getting that forage productivity, but we're not investing a whole lot of extra money into those pastures. So if we're at that approximately 50 pounds of nitrogen, that's kind of the breaking point for seeing productivity but keeping costs in check and not losing extra nutrients. Yeah, so species selection really becomes important and varies across farms. So depending on what one producer's goal is, it might result in a different species that they need to utilize versus than their neighbor. So one great example is just looking at the maturity of our cool seasons. So for example, cereal rye is one of the first to break dormancy in the spring, really takes off and will reach maturity, be ready to harvest quicker than some of our others that we utilize, like that winter wheat. So if a producer is planning to follow behind with beans or corn, looking at that cereal rye is probably going to be more beneficial than looking at some of those wheats, which would be better for grazing later on in the year. Same thing with our warm seasons as well. So typically we look at those being seeded sometime in June, maybe into July. But if we are looking at some opportunities to meet what's needed in terms of our grazing rotation, there's a little bit of flexibility there and when those can be planted to meet those needs of the cow herd for that forage that's needed. Yeah, so this research was really focused on some small plot work to get some initial feedback value of what the nutritional value of variety of species would be. Also got some numbers for expected yield. But again, we were on a very small scale, so we did a lot of intense sampling. Kind of the next step with this project is to take it to a larger scale and try to look at it on a bigger acre area on what we can look for producing that forage and how it can fit in. With this study, since we were on a small scale, we were limited on doing harvesting versus grazing. I think taking it up to another notch, adding in that grazing is also kind of the next step for this study to look at how those cattle respond to and utilize those forages. So obviously we know that there is some palatability differences among these species, and so looking at it on a larger scale would be beneficial too to see what those cattle prefer when they are grazing.
So my name is Patrick Wall. I'm the beef field specialist for Southeast Iowa for ICU Extension and Outreach. So my interest in this project was everyone had their own avenue as to why we thought this was important. I get a lot of questions in Southeast Iowa on economics. They want to do something, they're interested in soil health, they're interested in conservation, but they can't put out a big cash outlay to do so. Or they have to make it work with their current situation with the cow herd. They have a lot of things that they want answered before they're willing to write the check, so to speak. So some of it was, they'd have a seed salesman stop by and talk about the new great variety of XYZ for cover crops. How expensive were they? The cost of cover crops did go up as the popularity went up, as you might imagine. And then fertilizer costs were increasing too, they always have. But the economics, when we started the project, really presented themselves to sacrifice a few acres for forage to feed the cow herd when hay was just too expensive to buy. So how could we make that work, and could we make it compete with corn and soybeans? We're not talking about a huge acre outlay because, as you know, they can expect over 20 ton to the acre of forage when they do corn silage. So we had to be able to economically compete with that. One of the interesting things now is the duration of that project. We were pretty dry. Most of our drawback in terms of yield was just lack of rain, and we did it in 3 parts of the state. We know it doesn't rain the same everywhere, so we got a little variation that, in terms of rainfall. But we're in 2024 taping this now, and most of the state is wet. So I wonder now how much different this project would look if we continued through a much different weather pattern. Right now, cattle producers aren't nearly as concerned about hay because they're making enough off the acres they already have. But feeder cattle and fed cattle prices are record high. Cattle are really good property. So what could we do with a cover crop to increase our cow numbers off the same land base we already have? They're really going to continue to be interested in some of the parts of this project. What we don't know is how much better, how much different will our yield and forage quality measurements be in a much different climate that we're in now. Heavy rainfall is obviously beneficial to any crop. It's really beneficial to a forage crop. The drawback, when we talk about crops like cereal rye, they're very unforgiving when it comes to the weather window that we need to get in and harvest that crop off. You know, the insurance piece is also something that needs to be considered. Insurance agents have gotten much more relaxed on insuring a cash crop after a forage crop. You know, but what do we do for insurance if we take that acre completely out of production and put it into forage production for the entire year? Economically, they're not used to seeing something like that because they've never done it before. Some of the things that we ran across economically here, we might have an expensive seed that produces a really high quality hay, but if we can't get that established correctly, we've wasted all of that money. And some of the things we learned, you know, like crabgrass and teff grass and some of those varieties that we get a lot of questions about, when it's done right, that forage is incredible. We can't replicate that everywhere. And we used very typical equipment of what most, I would say, cattle producers in Iowa have available to them. We didn't go grab a new fancy drill. We didn't go purchase a bunch of high-tech new equipment to do this. We used what we had. And much of the producers that are asking us questions are very limited on equipment. They're more so limited on time. They have chores like everybody else. They've still got the cash crops to put in and take out. So we have to work around that window as well. Economically, we found that the simple process was still probably the easiest and the most beneficial in terms of forage production, forage quality, and the economics behind it. So I probably look at research as to showing producers what not to do as much as I do what we should do. And this project did both. I think we learned some of the things that we probably shouldn't do here in Iowa. And you know, the species selection, the seed companies are really interested in finding the new next shiny seed that we can use for this purpose. The producer wants something that's consistent. Cereal rye is really consistent. They also need to be able to sort of plan to manage year to year, even with weather changes. They got to know what to expect. Cereal rye, we've come to know what to expect. There's enough of it. Things like barley and even triticale to a certain degree, we've got a lot more to learn. So if we did those varieties year after year after year in different weather climates, maybe one would surface that in a certain scenario we should be using instead of the cereal rye that everyone's used to. We've summarized this report from a number of different angles. We do monthly columns in Iowa Cattleman's Magazine, Progressive Farmer, places like that. Our monthly newsletter is called Growing Beef. Probably the most valuable thing we learned from this project will be the ability for a producer to pick up the phone and call any one of the 6 field specialists in the state. And we can draw from the experience of this project and apply it to what they can do in their own personal situation. Every situation's different, every year is different. So we get a lot of those knee-jerk reaction calls, what do I do now, that this project can really help us answer.